You know what? I'm saving the best to last.
What's that?
We've
What
got
are you
something
hiding?
better than all of that. We've got something better than anything I've said so far.
What is it?
You want to know, don't you?
Yes,
And I know
definitely.
the people on the screen want to know as well. Well, in the early church, almost immediately, as soon as these writings were written down, as soon as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John later on, as soon as Paul's letters were written down, they were then sent out in the diaspora. They're sent out to the different churches in the diaspora, and they were, of course, being read in the churches. People were converting into those churches, and some of the people that were converting did not like what they were hearing. The Docetists, the Monarchists, they didn't like the idea that God could die or that God could have a son. You had the Gnostics who did not believe God should take on bodily form, that God must just come and that we get salvation through gnosis, through knowledge. We don't need a man, God who becomes a man. And so they just started disputing with the gospel accounts. The early church fathers had to do something with these disputes, and they had to come up with some type of defense. So the early church fathers started writing letters. Now what they did was very clever, and this is where I think God was in this. This is why I love God. He knew that this was going to be a question that came out in the 21st century. What the early church fathers did, they could have just disputed it using debates, could have just philosophically debated the issue. They didn't do that. What they would do in their letters, they would just write verse after verse after verse to support everything that to support or to defend against all these accusations. Verses out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, any of Paul's letters, any of the references from the New Testament. And they would then send these letters all over the known world of that time. Now, two men in the last century, one named Sir David Dalrymple and the other Dr. Jean Burgon. These two men have spent their whole life going all over the world amalgamating all these what we call early church fathers quotations. Quotations of the biblical text. And guess how many they come up with?
How many?
86,000.
Wow.
They have found 86,000 quotations from the early church fathers' letters.
Wow.
They went one step further. They wanted to find out, Dr. Jean Burgon wanted to find out how many of these quotations predated the 4th century. How many of them predated the Sinaiticus that we have in the British Library, the Alexandrinus that we have in the British Library, the Vaticanus that is in Rome. How many of these predated the Council of Nicaea, when many Muslims claim that's when our Bible was put together, in 325 by Constantine. So he just looked at those quotations that predated the 4th century. People like Ignatius, Irenaeus, Pappus, people like Polycarp, Athanasius. These are the earliest church fathers. Just looking at their quotations, guess how many quotations he came up with?
I don't know how many.
36,000.
Wow.
36,000 quotations, all predating the 4th century. That's 300 years before the Quran. They wanted to go one step further. They wanted to see how much of the New Testament these early church fathers' quotations incorporated. So they put them in chronological order from Matthew all the way to Revelation. And guess what they found? They found with just these 36,000 quotations from before the 4th century, they could reproduce the entire New Testament except for 11 verses. Ooh,
Wow.
I hope you're surprised.
Yeah,
I mean, this
blown
is
away,
great
yeah.
news. Because stop and think the significance of what I've just said.
Yeah.
They could reproduce all 27 books of the New Testament, all of them.
Just through the correspondence, the letters
Just
to each
from
other.
these quotations.
Wow.
From before the 4th century, except for 11 verses, 11 insignificant verses. Now show me any piece of literature, secular or sacred, that can make that claim.
I wonder from your perspective if there are some times where you hear someone defending the reliability of the Bible and you think, oh, no, don't do it that way. Or, maybe in your mind there are do's and don'ts. And I wonder if maybe you could share perhaps some perspectives on how you would go about defending the Scriptures.
There are plenty of do's and don'ts, and the biggest do's and don'ts have to do with citing other apologists where you haven't really studied and gotten your facts straight. I'm embarrassed to say that sometimes there are Muslim apologists who have done really decent research on the nature of the New Testament or on the transmission of the text or things along those lines, and they have cleared up kind of an apocryphal story that Christians believed in. There's one, for example, a story about that a number of scholars have passed on saying someone had pointed out that in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, only 11 verses out of the entire New Testament had not been able to be found in those church fathers' writings. Well, that was a garbled story that went back to the early 1800s, and it was a third-hand story of a fellow by the name of David Dalrymple. He was the one who actually was doing the research, and somebody heard about this at a party, and not directly from Dalrymple, but from somebody else, and then put it into a book, and it's been stated for the last 200 years as though it's gospel fact. What Dalrymple actually said was, in the first 2 centuries of the Christian faith, through AD 300, that all but 11 verses of John's gospel had been found in the Church Fathers' writings. He wasn't talking about the whole New Testament. And so this got communicated in such a way that said it was the whole New Testament that's been found. Well, that's just irresponsible and not at all helpful. And it was Muslim apologists who discovered the error. And it's been quoted by apologists, even text-critical scholars, and it was some Muslims who did research and said, sorry, that's not the case. Well, I don't like to see us getting embarrassed by that, and that's why we need to be very serious students and never afraid to really ask the tough questions and get into